you know, okay. Can we record it?
Yeah, that's fine. But
Okay.
you can't, it's not touchscreen, so.
Oh. um, so lost my train of thought, and we're glad to see you all online as well. I also need to do a huge thank you. And, as many of you know, we had a fundraiser not too long ago, and we were able to raise about $5,600 and gained about 15 new members. So thank you all very much. So glad to have you and to have your participation and your love. We've got a beach cleanup that we're doing with San Diego Whale Watch on September 21st. That'll be at Fiesta Island from 5 to 7 p.m. And we're always looking for volunteers. So if you'd like to come out and, okay, nice. If you'd like to come out and volunteer with us, just email us at San Diego, ACS-San Diego 10@gmail.com. Okay, thank you. I also have to apologize. I'm not standing in front of the camera. I lost my notes for this evening, so I'm trying to go from memory, and that's not so great. So the other event that we have coming up in October is October 5th is the Walter Monk Day, and that's I think 9 a.m. or is it 10 a.m.? Okay, I think it's 10 to 5 at Kellogg Park in La Jolla. And that's always a fantastic event. They are partnering with the Kumeyaay tribe and talk about all things ocean and climate. And then we do not have a speaker in October, so we'll be dark. And then right now we have a November speaker lined up, but it changed. And so now we're waiting to get confirmation and information from the current speaker. So just make sure you check our email, and that's acssandiego.org, or check our Facebook and emails. I was going to talk more about the Maui. We have been very curious about Maui because it's been a year after the fires. And I reached out to several people to find out about any changes in the waters or the environment or the animal behavior out there. And I had more details to provide, but of course I forgot them. But the bottom line is that they did these studies with drones, tissue samples, looking at debris and pretty much everything in the area of Lahaina, and have discovered there has not been a significant change. Now, that doesn't mean, there's not going to be something that's we'll learn later on. But for right now, after 1 year, they're not seeing significant changes in where the whales are coming or what the area looks like. So that's good news. Now we have our speaker for this evening, Audra Ames, and I don't have her information, and apparently what I wrote down is incorrect. So she has graciously decided to introduce herself. So without further ado, Dr. Audra Ames.
Hi, everybody. Off to a bit of a bumpy start, but it's okay. We'll recover. So yeah, thank you guys for being here tonight, and thank you guys that are here from Zoom. I don't know if you guys can see me a little bit better because there's the big light in the background. Well, I'll try to angle myself a little bit better so it's less distracting, but you guys aren't here to see me, you're here to see the slides anyway. So thank you guys for being here, and thank you guys from San Diego chapter of ACS for having me. I mean, it really is one of the only times that it's socially acceptable for me to talk about narwhals for an hour, so I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be here. I get to get away with a lot for tonight. So I'm Dr. Audra Ames, and I'm a bioacoustician, meaning that I study the sounds of living things. So that's bio and acoustician. And particularly for me, I study the sounds of toothed whales. So that's your species, all of your dolphin species, which includes your killer whales and your pilot whales, your sperm whales, your porpoise species, as well as, of course, your belugas and your narwhals. And I absolutely love my job. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of computer time. It's a lot of fun. And I almost was not actually an acoustician. For a little while, I thought that I wanted to study bottlenose dolphin behavior and cognition. So I joined Stan Kuchai's Marine Mammal Behavior and Cognition Lab in 2013. And then I heard a dolphin whistle for the first time, and it was love right away. And unfortunately, I think much to Stan's disappointment, my master's thesis was on bottlenose dolphin signature whistle development. He was a big cognition guy. So, but I think I had him as a signature whistle convert by the time that I left his lab. I pivoted my career from just looking at bottlenose dolphins to looking at a bunch of different toothed whale species. I got recruited to do my PhD at Oceanographic, an aquarium in Valencia, Spain. If you guys have been there, then you know it's an absolutely lovely place. If you have not been there, then I fully recommend it. It's an incredible facility. And because it's so incredible, I decided to stay when I finished my PhD at the end of May of 2019. And then I am just moving to San Diego as of December of last year and joining Dr. Ann Bowles' lab, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Ann. So I've joined the Hubbs SeaWorld Research Institute in her lab, and I'm getting to continue to explore super fun questions like, do narwhals have names? So hopefully everybody can see a little bit of that slide. Yeah. Okay, there we go. So before I kick things off tonight, I really want to drive home that toothed whales are sound-centered species, meaning that they heavily rely on sounds for survival. And they do this in two ways. They do this through echolocation, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with echolocation clicks here. Toothed whales use echolocation clicks to navigate in their environment and to forage, to go after prey items. And for those of you guys that have never heard echolocation, I have a little bit of narwhal echolocation to play you. And for those of you guys that have never seen a spectrogram, I don't know if you guys can actually see her screen over here, that gray black image with the white box around it, that's a spectrogram, and that's how scientists actually visualize sound. So the sound waves that are hitting our transducer, our microphone that's underwater, our hydrophone, that's being digitalized, sometimes within the unit, sometimes you need additional material for that. And then we can actually visualize that sound on a spectrogram, and then we can play it as well. So it allows us to know what's going on in the time and frequency domains. So this is, wait, everybody can hear it. Were you guys able to kind of hear that a little bit? Good news. All right, cool. Well, now we're off. So the other way that toothed whales rely heavily on sound is through communication signals. And we see them using particular communication signals to maintain contact with social group members, to advertise where food is. So bottlenose dolphins in Scotland use brays to say, hey guys, there's food that's over here. That's just one of examples of many different calls that these guys use. But what I'm going to be talking about tonight are signals that actually broadcast identity and what this means for toothed whale sounds. So in talking about communication sounds, we generally, for the more complex vocalizers, like your killer whales, your pilot whales, your belugas, and your narwhals, of course, we generally categorize their signals into three main umbrella categories. So the first is the pulsed sounds, and these are sounds that are pretty much characteristically similar to echolocation clicks, but we get a lot of variation in these sounds because animals will produce these pulses at super different speeds. And so you can have a really condensed packet of pulses, something like we call a burst pulse, that sounds like a creaky, like a whine a little bit. And then we also have slower repetition rate sounds that we call pulse trains, for example. These almost sound a little bit like that echolocation that you were just listening to, because while it is a singular unit, you can almost count the pulses that are there in that signal. Then we have whistles or tonal sounds. You guys will hear me use those terms interchangeably. That is because these guys, or these sounds sound like human whistles. And then finally, the more complex vocalizers produce what we call biphonations or mixed calls. And all toothed whale species, except for sperm whales, have two sound production sources. And what happens when the complex vocalizers are using these biphonations is that both of those sound sources are activated simultaneously. So most commonly, we see this expressed as what I have here on the slide, which is a pulsed sound overlapped by a tonal sound. We see this is a narwhal signal. All of these signals are narwhal signals. But with killer whales, we can see biphonations that are double tonal sounds. We also see pilot whales producing those sometimes. Belugas and narwhals will produce double pulsed sounds, but generally what we see are sounds like this. So hopefully everybody could pick up that tonal signal and that pulse signal. And for what I do, I am particularly looking for what we call stereotype signals within each of these sound categories. And the reason why stereotype signals that pop out within all of the different sounds that we look at on a different daily basis is because versions of calls are almost identical every time we see them on a spectrogram or hear them when we play them on our spectrogram. So just to give you an idea of what that sounds like, this is a bottlenose dolphin signature whistle, and you can see on the spectrogram, hopefully everybody can see here, on the spectrogram, that all of those shapes are very, very similar. And when I play it, all of those high-pitched whistles all sound very similar as well. And the reason why I look for this data, or Anne looks for this data when we're going through our communication signals, is because we've found through decades of research as in the scientific community that a lot of times these stereotyped calls might indicate individual or group distinction. So why is that important? Well, if we go back to the late 1960s and talk about David and Melba Caldwell, these guys found in bottlenose dolphins that when they separated animals out for medical procedures, the animals were separated from their social group members, that each of the animals actually produced one of these stereotyped whistles. So they just kept hearing the animals going, wee, 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 wee. And then on top of that, they found that each one of the dolphins, when it was producing a stereotype whistle, was producing its own distinct whistle. So each dolphin has what we call a signature whistle. And just to give you guys an example of that, I will play Bella again. So that is Bella. That's a female dolphin from Six Flags Discovery Kingdom, and that is her whistle. And then this is Billy from Oceanographic. And this is Neptuno from Oceanographic. And I am here to talk about narwhals. Otherwise, I could play you signature whistles all night long. This is my first love. So the signature element actually comes from that whistle contour shape. So hopefully you guys can see that either on your devices or on the screen up here. And then something that has been identified later on in more recent research is that we see these calls often meeting time criteria. So there's almost like a conversational ebb and flow when they're produced. So an animal will make its signature whistle and then wait for at least a second. Oh goodness, not a signature whistle. Wait for at least a second, and then if nobody responds, then they might call again. They never wait longer than 10 seconds. So there's this very almost stringent 1 second to 10-second rule that bottlenose dolphins follow. And we're starting to see that that might actually extend to other species as well. So signature whistles are super critical for bottlenose dolphin communication because this is how animals actually maintain contact with each other. And we know that these sounds are so critical for communication because of the length of time animals are actually able to recognize each other. These sounds are so important for bottlenose dolphin mother communication because during those first couple weeks of life, it is really critical that the calf can actually respond to know its mother's signature whistle. Otherwise, that could mean life or death for that animal. And we know that mothers and their offspring, through looking at the Sarasota dolphin population, that mothers and their kin can recognize each other for up to 14 years after the calf has separated from the mother. And when we're talking about animals in managed care, so Jason Bruck did for his PhD study, looking at animals recognizing each other's signature whistles that were housed together in managed care facilities, and they could recognize each other's signature whistle for up to 20 years. And the main take-home message from those values is those were only those values come from the limitations of the study. If they'd had relationships that were longer, I'm sure they would have found longer values for those two studies. One other thing that's really critical when we're talking about signature whistles is that Stephanie King and colleagues found that these guys will actually imitate each other's signature whistles. So it's not just that I have my own signature whistle, now my friend is using it as well. And this element turns out is super, super critical for broadcasting identity. So the Caldwells actually termed these signature whistles pre-actually understanding what a true signature is. So there's been more work on this in songbird species and in other toothed whale species done in the last few decades. And there's this idea that true signature signals are actually really rare in the animal kingdom. And so what the Caldwells had first stumbled onto was individually distinct calls. And it's correct that these calls are individually distinct calls. And that's individually distinct calls are much more common in the animal kingdom. Basically, anytime we go out looking for individual distinction in a species, we find it. But a true signature is actually much more rare because it has this element of broadcasting identity. And with individually distinct calls, you can get differences between animals based on morphology. So a bigger koala bear, a big male koala is going to have a much different looking vocalization than a small female because of their vocal tract length and things that we call formants that humans actually have as well that are distinguishing for our voices. But what bottlenose dolphins are doing is they're not relying on morphology for their signature whistle development. They're actually designing their signature whistle. So they hear sounds in their acoustic scene. They like, I like that. And that's what I'm going to call myself. And so this, you can imagine, involves some complex learning processes, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on. But basically, the take-home message from this slide is that all vocal signatures are individually distinct, but not all individually distinct calls are vocal signatures. So what is a signature signal? Well, I mentioned briefly that this is something that broadcasts ID, but what does that mean? That basically means that if I'm in this room and I use my name, everybody in this room is going to know that I'm referring to myself. But if Anne uses my name, everybody in this room is also going to know that Anne's referring to me. And that's what bottlenose dolphins do. So as you can imagine, this is extremely difficult to test, and it has been rigorously tested over decades. Again, I mentioned that whistle copying study. That was pretty fundamental in determining that these guys can do this behavior. But is it a name? So that's a little bit more difficult when we're talking about how humans use names, because really it's equating it to if I heard a sound I really liked when I was around 1 or 2, and then that became my name and that's what I called myself. And so a little bit, that's probably the closest we can get to a human analogy. So is it a name? Questionable. It's probably the closest that we can get in toothed whales. So as I mentioned, signature signals are usually individually specific, and that means that they're stereotyped. But I also mentioned that time specificity. So they really follow that ebb and flow. And we noticed that time specificity in bottlenose dolphin signatures, but what happens when we actually want to move outside of dolphins? Well, the story becomes a lot more difficult to tell. And that's because we have animals that are not producing whistles as potential contact calls. They're using pulsed calls or biphonations. So Kilu's call, this is Kilu from Oceanographic, if you guys can see him. His actual contact call looks like this. It doesn't look like a signature whistle. It looks like a pulsed sound with this noisy tonal component. And so it's also a little bit more difficult to define when we don't know a species' social structure, because more and more as we're moving along, we're finding that social structure is closely tied potentially with the types of distinguishing calls that animals choose. So bottlenose dolphins, for example, are fission-fusion, meaning that they are closely associated with maybe 1 or 2 other animals, and then they bounce around from a bunch of different social groups. So it makes sense that they have an individual identifier. The individuals are on their own and they're moving around a lot. But when we're talking about killer whales or sperm whales, which are matrilineal, then these animals actually have group signifiers, which makes more sense because they're always with their group. And curious about this, a good example of this was what happened with beluga calls back when I was finishing my PhD. So for a long time, we thought that belugas were actually matrilineal. My PhD supervisor found that when she studied beluga vocal development, that beluga calves developed calls that were similar to their mothers. I found that for my PhD as well. Shortly after I published my PhD, Gregory Crow and colleagues came along and produced a nice paper showing that belugas are probably more fission fusion, and if anything, that they return to the patriarchal sites. So that totally just blew everything that we were saying out of the water. But that's science. And so now that's, you know, we are kind of looking at these calls on more of an individual basis. So we actually have, in terms of determining whether these calls are individual signatures, everything but that proof of ID. So our animals using those signals to reference each other. So just to give you a little bit of history of what I mean by we have everything except for the ID. This research has really kind of happened, as you can see, in the last 20 years or so. Sophie Van Perrie and colleagues, I think up in Svalbard, were doing wild captures and tagging animals, and they noticed that there were these stereotype signals that were being produced when the animals were captured and separated. Then my PhD supervisor, Dr. Valeria Vergara, in 2008, was really the first one to kind of identify some more contexts that these calls were happening in. She was the first one to kind of identify that these calls were potentially individually distinct. And she was the first one to really talk about that these calls have potential signatures. And then she backed that up by showing that these calls were used similarly to animals in captivity as with animals in the wild. And that was in 2010. And then 2013 and 2015, two papers out of Japan, the Mishima and Morisaka groups, were trying to actually find where that signature was, because it's not so simple as the signature whistle. The signature whistle, you see the contour, that's the signature. But with beluga calls, you have this really long pulse component that's really drawn out, and there's a lot of variation within that call. Sometimes there can be that overlapping element, sometimes there's not. Sometimes animals have multiple call types, which is really fun. So they were talking about that in 2013, 2015. Elena Panova in 2017 was the first to really remark on individual animals having unique calls in captivity. And then again, Valeria, my PhD supervisor, published the first real comprehensive catalog on beluga individual calls in 2018. So we have a lot of evidence that these calls are signature calls because they are contact calls. We do see them being produced very context specifically. And they are individually specific. So every beluga has its own contact call. They're highly stereotyped. And for belugas, this means that the call is always broadband, meaning there's always a pulse component, and that it's always long in duration, meaning that it's always over at least a second in duration. And then, interestingly, though, like bottlenose dolphins, this signal still seems to follow that conversational ebb and flow. So there still seems to be this repetitive time-specific behavior that goes along, like with what we see with signature whistles. So that's something that's quite interesting and something to keep an eye out for when we're going through our data. But this is a call from Cairo. He's our big male at Oceanographic that unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. But this is his contact call. And you can see and hear that it's very, very similar. So that's Cairo. So our beluga contact calls true signatures, though, we still need that proof of ID. We have all of those other requirements there. But how do we get that? Well, I mentioned at the top of the talk that when dolphins are designing their signature whistles, there's learning involved in that. And so we can go and test some of those learning processes and see if belugas possess that same ability to vocally learn. And so that's a really good place to start, and that's where we're hoping to start very soon. Now moving on to narwhals, we actually know even less about narwhal contact calls. We're really just starting to scratch the surface here. So for a long time, it was kind of unknown whether these calls were even stereotyped. It was hypothesized by Ford and Fisher in 1978. And then it was all the way in 2006 that we had the next study of this information. And that was done by Ari Shapiro, who tagged 2 narwhals in Canada and showed that each narwhal had its own unique whistle and biphonation that it was different than the other tagged animal. So it looked like, yes, they did have some stereotype signals, and yes, these signals were potentially individually unique, but we need more information. And so as part of a larger study done with East Greenland narwhals in 2021, we added 4 more animals to that 6 animal group there in terms of identifying individually unique calls of narwhals. So that was a study that was opportunistic as part of a larger study I'm about to talk about. But it was the first time that we actually recorded narwhals producing contact calls. So they were recorded producing stereotype calls, but never in a contact scenario until this moment when there was a female that was captured and was being tagged as part of that larger study of the Scoresby Sound narwhals. And the tagging team noticed that off to the side, she had a calf. And during the tagging event, while she was being fitted with her ACS-San acoustic tags and her GPS trackers, she was continually vocalizing. And she was the only animal to do this out of the 18 animals 18 records that we got. She was the only animal to ever produce any sound while she was being tagged. And then that sound stopped as soon as she swam away and presumably rejoined her tag. And then what we see actually picking up on that tag, I'm going to explain again in just a second. But yeah, I want to play first the mother signal. This was actually what she was using while she was being tagged. And again, it has that very beluga contact call characteristics. And that's because narwhals and belugas are close cousins. They're the only 2 monodonid species. So belugas have been a great jumping off point in trying to understand narwhals because we do not have a lot of data on narwhals. So this is Isla from that 2021 study. A little bit harder to hear than the other ones, but you can pick up that she's still doing that conversational ebb and flow. So she's still waiting for her calf to call back. Whether she's actually hearing the calf or not, we don't know. So this is Isla. I just played her call, and this is her calf. And the reason why I wanted to show this was because this actually kind of loops back around to that social structure that I was talking about. So if you guys can actually see the screen or a screen, you can see that these 2 calls are very different. And so what that indicates to me is that possibly narwhals are fission fusion. Because bottlenose dolphins calves in the wild often develop signature whistles that are different from that of their mothers. Whereas if you remember when I was talking about belugas, the calves that we were studying were developing calls that were similar to that of their mothers. That's possibly due to those calves being in managed care. Often managed care animals will create a contact call or signature whistle that is similar to that of their mothers. So I'm going to play those 2 calls. Here's Isla again. And then you might remember this biphonation from the top of the call or the top of the talk. So that was Isla's calf. And we saw this call all the time in call and response bouts with Isla. And it stuck out to me as a calf signal when I was going through this data because I just finished my PhD with beluga calf vocal development. And so I knew backwards and forwards what calf calls looked like in these species. And right away was able to just, that's what that is. And we were all really, really, really excited. So do narwhals actually have signature calls? Yeah, I mean, they do have very highly stereotyped calls that we are finding. We don't actually quite know, despite having one really good example of this mother and calf, whether these calls actually are used in contact scenarios. So whether they are really context specific or not, we are still needing a little bit more evidence for that. They do match beluga contact calls characteristically in that they're broadband and they're long in duration. So again, over about a half to second in duration. And then we see them in those repetitive sequences. But we haven't really answered the question of individual specificity yet. So we really can't determine whether these calls actually broadcast identity. And that's what we're here to talk about, right? We're here to talk about signature signals. So we got to go back to that individual specificity in order to do that. So I mentioned that larger study on narwhals in East Greenland. And for that study, we captured 17 animals. We ended up with 18 records because there was one male that was captured, poor guy, 2 years in a row. So we ended up with 18 records. And from that, we went and looked for all of the stereotype calls in those 18 records. So that ended up being over 22,000 narwhal calls and over 3,000 hours worth of data. So this project took us about 5 years to really get through that data set. But doing that and then using a bunch of other really stringent criteria for determining which animal was our calling whale, we actually were able to find an individual call type for each animal. And just to give you guys a little bit of evidence for that, here are our whales. Dionys. So the case for individual specificity looks pretty good. So we will hopefully have this paper out sometime by the end of this year. And then this was actually just one other interesting side note, this red circle. We had that male that was caught 2 years in a row. His associate was caught with him another year, and they had actually a matching call. And they were the only animals to do that. So that was quite interesting. There's some fun anecdotes related to that call. And some not fun ones. Yes, both males, both closely associated males. So actually they got.
Did you know, I don't know, if you knew they have the same dam?
So that's such a good question. So this is one of the tragic things about the unfun things. They took a DNA sample and then they lost. The DNA samples got mislabeled, so we don't know. But yeah,
Well,
next time.
Talking about stereotypical calls, I'm assuming you mean repetitive.
So
Or not.
stereotypical calls are often seen repeated, but in terms of stereotypy, we just mean that when we see that call, every time we either see it on the spectrogram or we hear it, it's almost identical to all other iterations of that call. So I could literally pull the same dolphin signature whistle from January 30th of this year, from September 2nd, from July 15th, and all of those calls should be identical almost.
Sure, but different, and they're different individuals, or is it the same?
So
Yeah.
one animal has its own signature whistle that it repeats, and that's where we get the stereotypy from. So that animal has its own stereotyped call. Does that answer your question?
I'm a little confused about that.
Okay. I can come back to the signature whistle example in a little bit. So if we ask the question, are narwhal contact calls true signatures, we kind of get even less of a yes than if we're talking about belugas. We definitely have like I said, a strong example on whether these calls are used in contact scenarios, but we need more proof of contact before we can get to that proof of ID. And it does look like they are individually unique, but we've only looked at this in one population so far. So we're hoping to look at this in North Greenland narwhals next year, and then I'm starting to look at this in Canadian narwhals as well. But they do meet those time requirements. So a long story short, do narwhals have names? Not quite. We need more research. But they potentially do have some individually specific calls that might actually be true vocal signatures. Now, to round things out, why is this important? Well, from a conservation perspective, these guys are niche conservatives, meaning they like cold, deep water and they don't want anything else. And they live between 2 latitudes, and you can have Canadian narwhals and you can have Greenlandic narwhals and you can have no other types of narwhals. They only live around 2 different countries. So this is going to make climate change really hard for these guys. These guys are becoming more and more and more vulnerable. But potentially what we're going to try to do is set up passive acoustic monitoring devices around the coasts of Greenland in order to actually monitor populations using these calls. Because if we always see particular calls being emitted together, then we can track those calls and see what different populations are doing. We can potentially find differences between the contact calls of the North Greenland narwhals and the East Greenland narwhals and the Canadian narwhals that lets us know what populations are doing. And then we can also track individual numbers within populations as well. So say, for example, we have Andy, Mike, Tim, Kevin, Bill, and Bob here. We see them producing their calls all the time, all together. There's all 6 of them. Everything's great. Maybe we show up next year to do our surveys and Bob's gone. Where did Bob go? Maybe we show up the next year and Kevin and Bill are gone. So maybe that's an indication that the population is deteriorating and we need to do something. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any more questions. I can go back to the signature whistle example.
Demo, because when somebody else gives you your name, whereas if you're a dolphin, you kind of make it up on your own. And when you use it, you go, Ann, you know, as in I'm Ann and I'm here, but it can also be you saying to me, Ann, where the
Yes.
hell are you?
Yes. Yeah. So that's such a trick. It's such a tricky thing to try to apply. I really dislike doing it, to try to pigeonhole human behavior on another species, because they're another species and what they're doing is so unique and so different than what we do. But the reason why you often hear signature whistles addressed as names is because it makes the animals more relatable if you can equate them to a human behavior. But it's something I really dislike doing. And so if you were to actually ask me if I believe narwhals have names, I would say no, just because of that. But they do definitely have individual calls, and those are hopefully going to turn out to be vocal signatures. Otherwise, I am hypothesizing incorrect.
The lights are off. Can't see anything. How do you figure out where I am? I say,
Marco.
well. I say Ann, and you go Ann. So that then we're in contact, and that's basically what this is. And we just don't do it that way, but that's how they do it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, if I were to use my name more than other people were to use my name, if I was to walk around being like Audra, that's more along the lines of what signature whistles do. Yeah.
I had an experience in the wild with a lion spinner,
Okay.
and I was by myself in the water with a male, and he said something to me with his sentence, and then I copied it, and then he said it, then I said it, then he said it, then I said it, and then he cut out and he went and got his girlfriend's. But the whole time he was spinning around me like that, and he said it, then I said it. So I know what it sounds like. Can I say it and then you can tell me what you think?
Yeah, go for it.
I've never had this opportunity.
I'm glad to be of service tonight.
Okay, picture it in the water, just me and him, and he said to me, he said this. He goes, do 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 do. Then I copied it, and then he said it back, and he's like this. Do 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 do. And it had all this feeling in it, you know, like he was saying something to me. It was like a sentence. It was a sentence, but it was real loving or real sweet, and so I just copied it. What do you think?
I think I need to bring you next time my sons don't work.
You want to join my hair? That's what it was.
You brought the girls around.
Join my hair.
Many, you know, it was wild. It was my best ever experience.
That would be a very cool
All by
experience.
myself. There's other people around, but I got this because I went past the big waves with my snorkel equipment on, and nobody else would do it, and so I got lucky out there.
Yeah.
On the other side of the break, you know, he came and it was his territory. He checked me out, you know. He spun around me like this and said something, and I copied.
Well, I mean, we do see dolphin species copying sounds in their acoustic environment. So maybe he was giving you a cue and then he was copying what you were doing back. I mean, we see animals that develop signature whistles that look like they're trainers' bridges. or animals will also repeat computer generated sounds. So they'll do all sorts of different things as part of that unique ability to be able to vocally learn. But yeah, if you need a job, then I mean, next time my slides don't work.
How are the numbers? How are they listed?
What do you mean?
Belugas and narwhals, how are they listed, the numbers?
So
Are they vulnerable?
narwhals, I don't think
Endangered?
narwhals are not endangered or vulnerable. Belugas, it depends on the stock. So the Cook Inlet belugas are critically endangered. And so
I'm sorry.
so with belugas, it depends on the stock. So with
Talk about the different populations.
yes, so it depends on which beluga population you're talking about. So if you're talking about the Cook Inlet belugas, those guys are critically endangered. So are the St. Lawrence belugas. But all other belugas, I think the other beluga stocks are not in bad shape. And then narwhals are they're
I thought might be the other way around. That's interesting.
it
You don't ever hear anything really much about narwhals.
probably give it about a decade and it's going to be a big problem.
Are they more secretive?
They're extremely elusive.
Working in the wild with them, I mean, I know I don't want to be, anthropomorphic, but how would you describe the personalities that, over the years?
They're far more elusive. So narwhals, the reason why we don't have a lot of information on them is because one, they live in a really, really difficult habitat to access. And because they're very elusive. So you really have to work with the natives, the Greenlandic natives, in order to reach the animals.
And that kind of gives us another thing, they've experienced some selective pressure
Yes,
to be elusive.
yes.
So how many different, you're calling it stocks or different populations of each are there? Do you know?
Oh, belugas, there's 22. Narwhals, I can't remember. Because I think it's actually unknown because we've been calling the East Greenland narwhals, the Scoresby Sound narwhals, the East Greenland narwhals, but now there might actually be a genetically dissimilar other population out there, which would mean that there's two sets of East Greenland narwhals. So I think it's less known. I think the first really comprehensive report on beluga stocks was published around 2019. I think that was coming out right along the lines. It's the last international beluga meeting. So yeah.
We do not.
Yeah.
So I believe this certain species of chicken, dolphins and bottlenose have like these primary stereotypes with collars, but then there are other species of wellheads that don't have very stereotypic collars. Does that mean that they don't have a signature, or is there maybe
That's a super good question. So we have no idea because we've really only confirmed this in bottlenose dolphins. So any other cetacean species might have this ability. Yeah, it's up for grabs. But what my work is doing is really looking at this particularly in belugas and narwhals. So I don't know if there's individual specificity being looked at in like humpback whale songs, for example. I know that there's a lot of work being done on how that information is transmitted between animals and different populations. But I don't know if anybody's looking at like morphological cues or something like that in different. I might have had a former lab mate that was starting to look at that. But yeah, I mean. It's also very true. So baleen whales produce sounds completely differently than odontocetes do. So toothed whales pneumatically drive their signals. So they use air to pass through what we call the phonic lips, which are like literally lip enclosures that are right underneath the vestibular air sac in the blowhole. Mysticetes have like a larynx. So they actually like are using kind of, the idea is through CT stuff that the hypothesis is that they're using their throat and their larynx like a human would. I think is what Kuhn Elements came up with.
To get the girls. Oh, yes.
We have an Instagram, ACS Instagram. I don't know what you call them, site. I still haven't figured all this out. But I came across a video of some orcas, and the caption is researchers captured recordings of an orca whale imitating human voice. Are you familiar with this video at all? Or?
That in captivity?
And it was in captivity, and there we got a lot of comments, and it was that people were upset that we were sharing something about, you know, an animal that was in captivity. And our purposes is education.
Yeah.
And, you know, granted, I didn't really look at it. You know, I just thought it was kind of cool that, you know, an orca was caught on video imitating a human, but do you know about the video? I mean, there are people commenting about, yeah, you know, I mean, that was all the information that we got, because I mean, that's where a lot of the research that we have came from, is animals in captivity. And more with technology and stuff, we've been able to get out to get more information about this. But I was trying to look through the comments again to see.
Oh, is it Antibes?
Yeah, that's what I'm.
Yeah. It doesn't surprise me. I mean, Anne can speak to this better than I can because killer whales are Anne's expertise. But killer whales do have some vocal learning ability, and we see that through animals that mimic stellar sea lions. We see that through animals that mimic other dialects, other killer whale dialects. So it doesn't surprise me that they're mimicking human speech. Is that Jose Abramson's study? Is that what it is? Okay.
I don't know if you can tell by looking at
Yeah.
the, oops,
So that might actually be from a colleague's research study. He's done some like copy behaviors with killer whales in Marineland and Antibes. But
I think part of it was that it's in captivity, but I think the other part was, do we hear what we want to sometimes with these calls? Like,
is there a bias?
you know,
Yeah.
And
that's a hard thing to tease out when you're talking about these types of studies. There's a study that exists like that for beluga whales too. Sam Ridgway of the Navy did that, and he just it's you go into it knowing it's going to be subjective, and you have to walk away with your own interpretation of it. And he provides, if you look at the spectrogram of that sound, I'm like, I see this in belugas all the time. But if you actually go and listen to the supplementary material that he provides, it's convincing. It's really convincing.
Yeah. Well, I lost it to be able to play it, but I think can you, if you play it, I don't know if everybody here can hear it, but yeah, I know it's I don't know, it's fascinating that we can catch this stuff, and we know they're communicating, and that they communicate so differently from us. But we have heard the stories about them mimicking other animals to well, the orcas to eat them, but
well, it's also just that's the very process that we're trying to look at when we want to answer these questions about whether these signals broadcast identity. When we're looking for a place to start and whether these animals have that vocal learning ability, it's actually those studies where animals are mimicking other species, or they're mimicking other animals that they've never been around, and all of a sudden they're there and they're producing that sound. Yeah, exactly.
So I have a beluga here imitating a woman in an aquarium.
That could be that Sam Ridgway. Oh, that's probably Juno.
Have you seen this?
That might be Juno. Is the mystic beluga that's literally like in all. Oh no, that's.
Oh my God.
Have you seen that?
I have not.
So I tapped my phone around.
We've been on phones all night.
We have a question from Zoom.
Oh, sure.
So maybe turn it down. Are there similarities with names in the same populations and differences in names between different populations? Is there a style of name specific to pods or populations? We're getting that on the recording.
That's a super good question. So the question was, I'll start with the first question. The first question was, are there differences? What's the variability within social groups in terms of whistles? Was that the first question?
Yeah, it should be on the chat. Are there similarities with names in the same populations and differences in names between different populations?
Yes and no. So when we see similarities within a population, it's likely going to be between bottlenose dolphin females and their male calves. But that hasn't always been super consistent. We see calves in managed care developing signature whistles like their moms, or like, again, trainers' bridges or other sounds that are available in the environment. But at the end of the day, they are animals and they only have a finite amount of sounds that they can produce. So you do get some overlap in signature whistles between other social groups. So for example, I might see a contour over here at in this population that shows up kind of similar in this population. And so, yeah, you definitely can have some contour overlap, if you will. I don't think we've gotten that far in terms of knowing this about belugas and narwhals. I mean, we only have 18 records, so so far they've all been individually pretty different. But with belugas, I haven't seen quite. There's a broader range the animals can do vocally. And so I haven't seen as much of an overlap there. But what's actually interesting, there was a recent paper that came out, I think in either last year or 2 years ago, that showed that there was population variability or population differences between contact calls, and that potentially you could use parameters between different beluga groups to distinguish which beluga group was calling. So there's definitely a potential there for looking at population-based characteristics.
And then the follow-up, is there a style of name specific to pods or populations?
So that's a
I know.
boat just started rocking.
If this boat's a rocking.
So in terms of style names, killer whales, for example, are a good example. They pass their call down matrilineally. Sperm whales do that with codas as well.
Then there are quite striking distinctive characteristics calls. For example, killer whales in the Antarctic, you can instantly tell that they're from the Antarctic as opposed to the North Pacific.
Have accents.
Well, that's the analogy that people have made.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to be the result of small changes over time that kind of makes them very apart.
Yeah.
Of separation.
I saw a map. See, that's all the different kinds of organs. I had no idea.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's been the challenge because they also have a lot of genetic distinctiveness between some of these populations. And so the question has been, was it the result of genetic change that the sounds became different from one another, or was it through learning? So that's one of the things that our work and the kind of work that she's been doing is really important for being able to distinguish between what is genetic and what is learned.
Do you girls?
Will we ever know? Well, so I mean, for the killer whales, it's clearly learned. We've been able to show that crystal clear because they're able to match the sounds of bottlenose dolphins. No way that's genetic. And because they're able to cross-socialize and learn from a different dial.
Do you girls go up to the Antarctic and everything and study these guys?
So up to the Arctic, I go to so I'm starting to go to Greenland beginning next year. I started going last year. It's amazing. It's actually incredibly. It's well, yeah, basically. Actually, they're probably doing a lot better than I am. I'm really layered up.
Another question from Zoom. What's the state of playback research with cetaceans? Any chance of us learning to speak beluga or narwhal? You can reach those questions.
So playback studies, it depends on the species and the research question that you're asking. we will never learn to speak beluga or narwhal though, and I can say that with absolute 100% certainty because we are not belugas and narwhals. We have no idea if these guys use language like human beings use language. Human beings use language as representations of symbols that we string together, and that has meaning. And we have no idea if these guys are able to do this, if they can do it, if they do it, how often, when, and I just don't know if we will ever have the ability to decode entirely what these signals mean. We can certainly get close by looking at the context that they're produced in, and seeing behaviorally what the animals are doing around the calls, and that might be as good as we get for a long time. There's no day of the dolphin happening anytime soon. Sorry, guys.
Okay, the playback.
Yeah, so they will respond to their contact calls, or if you play dolphin signature whistles, they'll respond with their signature whistles. So, and that's those kind of contextually calls that, you know, we have that contextual information for.
Would you just say it's just a simpler language?
I would actually never use the term language, because we have language.
Or simpler communication.
Communication,
within-
yeah. And I wouldn't go to say that it's simple because we haven't been able to figure it out. So we have no idea how complex it is. It's different. It's a different communication system.
Are you seeing the communication repeating something like alarms or food and you know, important things like that?
Yes, so that's what
breeding behavior and stuff like that.
Yes, so that's what we mean by those contextually specific calls. So when we're talking about contact calls, that's because they're being produced in those contexts. Animals are using them for contact. So if a calf gets separated from its mother and it can't see its mother, that signature whistle becomes really, really, really critical, or that contact call becomes super critical. And so that's how we can start attributing meaning, if you will, to some of these signals, because we can see what the animals are doing behaviorally. Yep, exactly.
We're just taking little baby steps with that one. There's another cool one. I think it was Beluga, the victory squeal.
Oh yeah. The
Beluga.
victory squeals.
What did he do? She do. This is in experiments that Sam Ridgway did. The animal gets the answer right. He gets a bridge to tell him that he got it right. He goes,
Dolphins. So yeah, the idea is it's based around dopamine release. It's the pre-food squeal.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
The bottlenose dolphins do that as well, and we were looking at some of it, like after trainers bridge a behavior, that's when you actually see these victory squeals in trained animals. So there was a tandem behavior with two males that were doing this behavior, and as soon as they bridged the behavior, both of the males did a victory squeal simultaneously as well. So they did the tandem behavior, and they both came down going, "Woo!" And it was amazing.
Fun.
That's amazing. Well, thank you. Any other questions or comments or anything? But thank you very much for coming in this evening and doing this. Thank you all at home for joining us. And we will not see you in October, and we might see you in November. So just keep watching your emails and all our other communications. I just went blank. Website, Instagram, and we'll be emailing everyone as well. So if you want to be on our email list, please email us at ACS-San-Diego10@gmail.com. Excuse me. Is that it? Okay. My brain fried the last couple of days, and it didn't cool off enough today to get to reboot. So, but thank you all, everyone, and have a great night, and join us again, hopefully in November. I'm looking at this cute little beluga here on the screen. So have a good night. Thank you.